All right, so just like that, we're live. I am really excited to dive in with you, Dwight, and talk more about your recent journey and whatever else our conversation goes. But I think a good place to kick it off would be just for filling in on context. Maybe just mention who you are and what you've recently built would be a good place we could start if that works. And welcome.
Fantastic. Thrilled to be here. Yeah, I think a little bit of context never hurts anybody. Name's Dwight Crow. As background, been bumping around in Silicon Valley for some time. Did low latency data center switching as my first job out of college. Started a AI NLP company that eventually we sold to Facebook. Ran the Facebook e-commerce team for a few years, and most recently, the last 5 years, have been building a hearing aid that, unlike most hearing aids, which sort of make things louder, this one actually makes them clear by removing the background noise. And the way we did that was we crammed a whole lot of artificial intelligence, deep learning, whatever you want to call it. This one specifically could do intelligent semantic segmentation within the spectrogram rather than the usual image domain. And we crammed it into a bunch of edge compute in a hearing aid, which is a extremely form factor dependent, low energy, low latency, sub 10 millisecond development platform for this algorithm. And we did that. We launched a year ago. I was the founding CEO and first engineer at the company, if I demean the title of engineer enough to include what my talents also can produce. And then guided it up until about 4 months ago when I became the chairman, and now I'm guiding more strategically.
Oh, cool. And
Yeah.
more technically, when you say low latency and you mentioned the word platform, it is building a product. So you're selling. I mean, the company is selling
We
hardware
sell hearing
devices.
aids.
Yeah.
So we sell physical, FDA-approved hearing aids. And sort of the big innovation is actually it's a small device that goes behind your ear, looks like just like any other hearing aid, same form factor, sound that everyone loves. But then in addition to that, we have a little thing that goes in your pocket, and that has 1,000 times the compute of any other hearing device and incredibly low latency, so you can get all that amazing extra AI goodness for clarity, and it allows it to continuously get better. We're much like a Tesla, and unlike the average medical device, we keep pushing software updates, so your hearing aid starts smart and gets smarter every time you use it, which is
Uh,
pretty novel within the space.
so is the concept of having computation outside of the actual earpiece part of the breakthrough and how it's structured, where you mentioned is something you just clip on your pocket or have nearby?
Exactly. Yeah, kind
Yeah.
of like an AirPod case. Very much so. That allows us to do a lot of computational power and connectivity that you wouldn't get in a standard form factor. So it's obviously an ask, but we think it's one that, when you really want that edge in hearing and to always be at the cutting edge of hearing rather than buying a device and having it slowly become more obsolete over time, that a lot of people have found to be of tremendous value.
Interesting. And
Yeah.
so if I think of like sound coming in, I would imagine that the most difficult areas where people are trying to hear, this is relevant for me because my dad is in this situation. When it's in a room, particularly a large room, many people or many things going on, and you're having a conversation. So there's a lot of background noise. And
Yeah.
is that does it work? I mean, I'm curious, just a couple threads of how the technology works. Does it lock on to a particular voice and then amplify that voice somehow and reduce what it
Yeah, I
recognizes?
can't go into the exact details of how we've designed the algorithm that
Nor
starts
would I
with any sort
understand
of
anyways.
secret sauce. Well, increasingly me, we hired a bunch of the just the best engineers out of the best hearing aid companies, Google, Facebook, everywhere. We got a bunch of the very best engineers and put them. So I'm increasingly the dumb PowerPoint leadership guy. But the way it works is we've trained it in data sets where we went out to restaurants and collected these actual data sets of real world surround sound and that chaotic plates clinking and glasses and voices and fans and mariachi music, what have you. And then we trained it to separate out the voice of interest. That is the dominant voice that we think most people would be listening to. And we keep the rest of it in, but we just turn it down a little bit so you're still aware if someone else talks to you. But what we've really focused on is uplifting that primary voice for greater intelligibility.
Mm. And when you put it
And
on,
this
is
is
it
way down. Mhm.
Is it similar to like if I put on my these Bose noise canceling headphones? That's different. But probably less sophisticated, right? Because it's taking whatever's outside and dampening it versus.
Yeah, the end effect might be similar, especially let's say you take a Bose, and I have massive respect for Bose, by the way. They also entered the hearing aid space. I think they're doing a very different approach than us, of a very low end hearing aid that kind of like ironically doesn't do any of this massive noise cancellation or fancy stuff, but is really trying to open up the market. We've gone the other direction of really powerful noise cancellation, etc. And what Bose does generally is they are, for one, they're actively canceling. So if you're a normal hearing person and you put on some Bose headphones, they will figure out the dominant waveforms and they will create antithetical phase waveforms to cancel those out. Whereas more of what we do is selectively amplify. We're working with people that already have hearing loss. So we're saying, hey, let's do that. And, just to belabor a point, but it's important, a lot of the sort of classical signal processing technologies that Bose and other hearing aid makers make are based on very static noise forms, jets, air conditioners, things that go over a long period. They work great for those. Dynamic things where two people are talking over each other, or suddenly there's music or a plate, create the situations where it really matters, where you're struggling to hear someone. That's where we shine, where we can statistically capture dynamic noise profiles in a way that has never happened before really artificial intelligence started tackling the problem.
That's cool.
Yeah.
And so how did you Yeah, no, you do a really good job of explaining it, what is quite a complex technical topic in a simple way, which I appreciate. How did you choose the initial technologies? Like, probably the hardware is, I would imagine, not all that difficult, or you don't have to be as innovative on the hardware piece, I would imagine, but it's more the software.
I've got some fun stories here, and so on two sides. One, how did I end up on this idea? It's a little, they say every journey you often end up back at home.
Yeah.
My dad has hearing loss, and he struggled to hear in loud restaurants for as long as I can remember. So that was kind of the inspiration for the problem. I hadn't done, I'd done hardware right out of college, but I hadn't done hardware in years, and I wasn't particularly good at it. I'm a software engineer by training. And, I think maybe the lesson here, I'll give you two things, is one, just don't be afraid to jump in. A smart person can usually, just by jumping in, you'll get to the next data point, which will sort of ping pong you around until you get somewhere smarter. Like if you're saying, how do I do it? Jumping in and trying, I think, is a much shorter path than, as a counterexample, saying, man, I'd better go get a master's degree.
Right.
Like, the master's degree will get you 3 hops closer when you start, but you could also do that by just spending 3 weeks on it.
Yeah.
So thankfully I did that. I was doing embarrassing stuff where when we started this, I had I'm trying to remember the name of the, only just real hardware nerds are going to get this, but there's something called a NVIDIA Tegra chip, which, for reference, is like a small computer that was used in self-driving cars. And somehow, in my naive software head, I was like, well, yeah, we'll just use that and we'll clock it down a lot, and then you could put that in your ear. And like, this was just such a horribly naive and like orders of magnitude wrong when I look back on it assumption, but it's what got me started and got me talking to the people who were like, oh, you should actually use this chip and this is how you should actually do it. And and eventually got me to the place where I said, hey, I can select some chips that are correct, and I know the correct paradigms to eventually realize that we could do something in your pocket. Now that was another realization where you just kind of have to look at it and say, okay, I've done the math. We can't do this compute in your ear. What could we do? And I was thinking, well, could we do it through the internet? Latency's a little too high. Could we do it with wires? Well, nobody would wear it. And eventually, I kept coming back, like, if we could do something wireless, but Bluetooth is too slow. And it was, I was reading journal papers on wireless over-the-air robotic control theory. Again, not because I read that in my spare time, but I was just looking for examples of low latency systems, and they'd actually built a number of proof of concept protocols with, 400 or 500 microsecond latency, and this was enough for me to know that it was possible. And so I think that might be a lesson of, many smart people will think that the fastest way to determine whether something is possible is to try to build it themselves. And something I wish I had known more of, and I've learned to do more of, is scan the literature to see what other people have done. If someone smart could do it within the time frame for a company, there will be a paper on it. You will be able to find it, and that'll prove you it can be done. Now, even then, there's probably academia works in one exact situation whenever the stars are aligned. So you need to check will it work robustly in all the awful ways consumers will use it. But that's such a shortcut, and and then again, it helps if you've got a bit of a reputation for success. But the thing I wish I told myself earlier is stop trying to build it yourself. Just hire the person that wrote the paper and move on with your life. That's the correct thing for a founder to do.
Yeah.
So those were two big lessons for me, but it was a lot of fun. And boy, it's just such a joy to go to first principles and look at what is possible in the world when you really re-examine the sort of play blocks you're given with and throw away some of the paradigms that others have used those Lego blocks for.
Yeah, totally. That's a good point. And in your case, the first principles that may have been overlooked given the advancement in technology was all the computation, or any computation, has to be done in the ear. So just the concept of, hey, we could make something relatively small, put it in your pocket, send uploads to it, and that has low latency. And it's really not that bad. It's really, I don't think, I can't imagine people would have that big of an issue with it, considering we already have a phone, or, we're used to AirPods or something.
Demonstrably, America's willing to carry the AirPods in their pocket.
Yeah.
You give enough of a benefit. Now, unless you're providing benefit, why would you?
Yeah.
But if you can provide benefit, game on.
And so did you end up reaching out to the guys who wrote the paper?
No, I wasn't smart enough at the time.
Okay.
I should have.
And how
I wish I was that smart.
When you say dive into literature, are there specific places, or do you just Google around at Google? Yeah.
Google Scholar and keywords are your friend. Usually it's a combination of Google Scholar to keyword to find your smartest friend in the field via either a cold intro to an author, or your smartest friend that's close, and then they'll send you to a new paper and repeat.
Yeah. Interesting. And do you, after having gone through that process, do you feel like there's a lot of literature either in this area or broadly that is where are we at with literature? I mean, do you feel like there's sufficient useful publications coming out, maybe on hardware, software, a ton?
Yeah. Well, let's be precise there. I was about to make some joke about we need more Novikovs in the world. Where is literature today? But I think I'll speak where I know, and then I'll speculate slightly outside of it. AI is going through just some of the best literature that's ever existed. Archive has transformed the rate and freedom and ease with which you can see papers. You can get the paper with the preprint before you even get to the conference. Conferences have served as a useful place for a bunch of people to get to the same geolocation to discuss it, but the papers are out early, and we have sort of moved beyond needing nature to tell us what's good. You just look at who published it and who cited it, and whether your friends are talking about it. Obviously, that requires you to have a bit of a community, but Reddit is a good first approximation. What papers are good, or Hacker News. Now, are there papers in if you were doing something crazy in the Linux kernel? I don't know. Yeah. You probably need to get it. I imagine there's some discussion community where you can find the right people and you can read the threads. And almost every technologist I know, because technology is a horizontal rather than an industrial vertical, technologists help each other to change the world rather than compete for the same fixed pie. Unlike, say, finance or high-end restaurants or something. So most technologists will eagerly help you if you write a thoughtful email that shows what the hell you're talking about, and say please, I'm just I read your paper, it's really good, I had 3 questions, any chance you could help me. Other things that I think are really advancing, robotics control theory, a lot of great papers. Most of bioinformatics and genetics and biology, CRISPR, great papers. most of the hot areas right now for hard tech, I think there's some tremendous documentation that is easily accessible to the average person.
Yeah.
So I would say it's never been easier and more democratic to access the bleeding edge of innovation from anywhere in the world with a working command of English and access to the internet.
Yeah, that's super interesting. I've often thought, I wonder if there's like a more organized way of coming up with good business ideas. Oftentimes you'll meet people who they want to get into startups, they want to build a startup, but they don't have a good idea that they feel either emotionally excited about or just intellectually knowledgeable about. So they're kind of idea fishing. And then there's people who, they worked on a startup, the startup idea isn't working, and so now they need to make a hard pivot and to do something else. And I've wondered if there's a way to more or less connect the bridge between the academic research that's being done and the actual in-practice entrepreneurship startups that are being executed on. And I've thought, like in healthcare in particular, they launched these new codes, what is the name? ICD-10 is the name of an approved reimbursement code that the government will have to pay for different healthcare procedures and devices and things. And I've thought, okay, if these kinds of things are not front page TechCrunch, they're not easily accessible in many ways. And if a researcher at some university publishes a breakthrough technology, how does that get to the market unless somebody stumbles across it? Usually it goes from idea, like, hey, my dad has a tough time hearing, I want to build this product, your pathway, to then research the literature. But I've wondered if you could reverse engineer that and say, okay, we're going to kind of synthesize all the research that's gone out there. We're going to and find the ideas from that, or if that's just a solution looking for a problem, which may well be.
I think we need both. Maybe to speak to it, like a theme I see in startups, and slap me through the internet if this is too obvious, is that, obviously the most important thing is there is a problem. There's something that you could build that people want. But, it turns out there's a lot of smart people out there. There's about 7.5 billion of them. And if there were materials that existed in Roman times, I guarantee you are not going to assemble them into a new thing that people haven't thought of yet.
Yeah.
I clearly someone's gonna prove me wrong by doing this with like glass and lead or something. But odds are you're not gonna be the one that is the first person to think of this over 1,000 years and a bunch of billions of people trying. Now that means that you should look for a problem and then you should say, what is new? What recently happened? Did we change from ICD-9 to ICD-10 and there's now an arbitrage opportunity in the reimbursement rates? Is it that AI happened and we can automate things in visual, audio, or textual analysis that previously humans couldn't do? Is it that motors are cheaper than they've ever been, and now we've got pretty good controlled drone theory where I don't have to reinvent drones. I can just say I can put a flying thing anywhere in the world within this price and this consistency and this latency. What could that do for this problem? And so the thing I've seen is usually you need to deeply understand a problem. You need to be motivated by helping something people really want. But then you probably want to understand something new that changes whether this problem is tractable. And when you look at any major creation of value in the last 200 or 300 years, most of them seem to follow that pattern where Rockefeller's people like burning stuff for their lights. We're currently doing it by killing whales, the most slow way you can imagine. But what about this black stuff out of the ground? And he built the definitive American business empire, or at least one of them out of that. Edison did similar. He's lights. Turns out electricity is a new thing. Genentech was DNA and peptides. Google was the scalable internet and the World Wide Web. The web, phone. We all know the modern examples, but consistently, it is a new technical innovation that actually makes the new market and company much more so than the great man individual or great woman individual.
Yeah, there's a great book I just finished reading on this subject called How Innovation Works by Matt Ridley, and he talks about a bunch of different examples like this, where he discusses kind of this bias that people have to thinking that somebody invents something and therefore there's a business that just springs up after it. And oftentimes it's the other way around. Like you're just stumbling and experimenting, and you come up with something, and then the science in the academics explains it later. Like we don't, you go from practice to literature as opposed to the other way around. And he's like, that's actually much more common than people think when they think about actual innovation in practice in the real world, which I found fascinating.
Oh, fun. Can you give some examples?
Yeah, so one, I mean, certainly the light bulb would be one
Got
of
one?
them. We're
Okay, yeah.
just experimenting on that. I think another was he talked a lot in healthcare. People would do things like doctors didn't understand germ theory, but they knew that people
Mm,
were dying when they would. Uh, it was actually soap. So people figured out they thought soap had something to do with it, but it wasn't conceptually that there's these little microbugs going around and affecting you and the whole immune system and everything. So they just
yeah.
they stopped. They wore gloves. Yeah, so they wore gloves and washed the gloves with soap, thinking that the soap would do something. And then later on, of course, we discovered that it's germ theory. But it wasn't like, hey, we discovered germ theory, guys, stop operating, barehanded.
Yeah.
So yeah, kind of those examples where if you think about it, almost in nature, that's how that would work. Where the tiger doesn't need to understand why his prey is doing something. They just observe it. They observe the patterns that's going on, and then they capitalize on it. So I kind of think of we're just giant, very complex pattern recognition machines, and science. I think conceptually, science is looking at the collectible, what we call objective, which is shared subjective. Do you see that? I see that. We all see that. We agree it's objective,
Yeah.
and we say that's very consistent. We can never say it's absolutely true, forever and all time, but it's very, very consistent. And science is like the obsession with studying what is more or less consistent.
Yeah.
What patterns are more true, more reliable than others. I mean, that's kind of the first principles assessment of what I think science is. But yeah, kind of transitioning that into discovery, it's like we stumble on patterns, we make stuff, and then we figure out why the stuff works behind the scenes. And I think
Yeah.
the whole area of kind of like human improvement, biohack. I don't know if you probably wouldn't put Whisper in that category of biohacking, but it's not far from what people are doing to try to enhance the meat suit that we're in, and especially when it starts to
Yeah.
break down in various ways. I think there's the idea of fixing the body, fixing as we start to age and things wear down, versus enhancing. Enhancing is I put that more in the biohacking category. Uh,
Yeah.
I'm a benefactor of LASIK surgery, and LASIK is an amazing invention to through lasers cut open your cornea and change the structure of your lens so you can see better. And I've wondered, is Whisper in this? Is there a bigger pattern going on where Whisper looks at hearing? We have 5 different senses. Could there be other ways to improve sensory degradation over time, or is just hearing's what works? So sight,
No,
vision,
I think
sense.
you're 100% right. I mean, there's so many great topics to touch on there. But, will humans improve themselves? I sure hope so. And I think we will. If you want proof of it, like, this is a questionable proof, but the fact that doping can create, superhuman performance for professional athletes indicates that there are ways to get performance that cannot be achieved without, scientific impetus. And I think that there's places where we would consider that cheating, and there's places where we'd say, yeah, what if actually we discover something that can make all humans 5% smarter? And those are maybe out there, but I'll give you an example of one that is less out there. The telescope is a superhuman ocular fixture that by putting it up to your eye, you can see things you would never be able to see otherwise. And some of the applications of that are just faraway ships. Some of them are galaxies, millions of light years away. I think we've got similar stuff in terms of sound, radar. Clearly we're building out the human sensory experience in ways that have never existed. I think we're augmenting our, it gets philosophical, like what's the human, what's not. But like, if you want to consider it that you're driving the car, but you're augmented by anti-lock brakes. You manipulate the brakes, but there's something that's jiggering them just right, so you're braking as fast as you humanly could without skidding. Um, so many of these things seem possible, and I expect we're just touching the beginning of the iceberg. If you want to consider that, we're really getting into in vivo gene therapy. What if you could say, hey, take this shot, and the meat bag suit that you're inhabiting is suddenly going to be a meat bag suit that is joyful and energetic 80% of the time.
Do you think there's do you think that looking back in history, there's often, very often cases, and I'd say this, it's the default, that whenever we make a breakthrough in some sort of technological breakthrough using everything from a stick and spear to fire all the way to modern day, there seems to be, not always, but very, very often, negative, unforeseen repercussions from that. Do you feel like there are, do you have any negative unforeseen and the other thing that's interesting is we tend to realize those negative repercussions over quite a long period of time before it's kind of accepted as in the collective consciousness.
Yeah.
And I wonder if you've seen any of those in, say, picking in this domain of body enhancement where, like, CRISPR is still pretty early. LASIK, I think LASIK is kind of an exception to the rule there, where there doesn't seem to be a negative repercussion. It seems fairly straight. It's not chemical or hormonal, so
there's occasional complications.
Right.
You get the halo and whatever. I mean, I would say most technologies are on a scale of, how many second order unanticipated consequences there are. Those second order consequences can be good or bad. When we had first invented cars, everyone said, "Oh my God, thank goodness we finally solved the horseshit problem."
Yeah.
Right. Like it was like a crisis. Like cities were just piling up with manure, and they're just like, "Oh, thank goodness, it's just air it puts out. How magically clean." Now of course we've got this 70 years later, we've got this tremendous global warming problem. And, or a more common one that I think is very in vogue today to talk about, especially this week, is we invented these magical devices that let us connect to anyone, anywhere in the world. And now we've got kind of an addiction where there's many negative second order effects of seeing less and less of your closest friends in real life and more of this very, collective panopticon of friendship. Every technology has its pros and cons. One of the few ones that probably doesn't is like penicillin. Who's going to be like, man, it's so great that no one, or it's terrible that no one dies at 30 of common infections anymore.
Yeah.
I think a lot of them will be purely good. If we could make something that no child died of a common infectious disease, again, I just don't know what human could possibly contest that.
Yeah.
A more controversial one is if we extended life to 200 years. If you think it's a problem where the boomers have all the money and the houses and the government seats today, wait until they live to 200 and they're not passing any of their wealth on. They're just making you live in the basement for 150 years. The technology creates changes, and many of those changes require reassessment of the structures that were built prior to the new technology. So, like the Second Amendment wasn't designed for freaking AK-47. It wasn't. Whether it should be changed or not, I don't know, but it should certainly probably be reassessed under the new world conditions. So, long story short, I would expect there are surprising changes. The medical ones, I think most of them will be largely positive, but anytime you profoundly change society, you are going to get novel second order effects, and I think it's our responsibility to not be afraid of those changes, but to meet them bravely and have the courage to say, hey, this might mean we need to change other things.
Yeah. Yes. Is health you've been thinking a lot about I call it the world of like health tech for a while. Is that still a big interest of yours, or have you since sort of branched out since moving to now chairman? So I imagine it's not as immersive as an experience, at least as many hours a week as it once was. Remind me too, before you answer that, where's the state of the company? I guess people is probably most relevant.
Yeah, we're in California. We're about 75
Mm,
team members. We've been growing like a weed. I just I can't say the exact stats, but tremendous customer satisfaction, NPS scores. Better than Coca-Cola. It's an exciting time. I think we're going to really help a lot of people. Now that said, for my personal interest, I'm still deeply involved as chairman, but it's less day to day.
hmm
It's much more strategic, and it's letting the amazing team that we've brought on execute and really bring this technology to the masses. For me, I think health is so profoundly inspiring, but there's a lot of other really cool things. If I were to name just a couple topics that I think are really interesting, I think American energy policy is going to be really interesting, where there's a few opportunities now where you could see every American having 10 times cheaper energy in the next 20 years than we've ever had. And that translates to a lot of life improvements where, things that are dominated by fuel costs like flights suddenly become meaningfully cheaper. Um, Things that are dominated by energy costs like transportation, and cost of goods, shipping it around the world become meaningfully cheaper. Ways to farm become different. There's a lot of really interesting stuff. I think, education's up there, creating personalized didaction for pupils. Where I don't know if you've ever seen the Bloom study. It's the study that essentially says for any student, if you give them 100% one-on-one coaching versus a 30-person classroom, they will, on average, perform 2 standard deviations better than they would have in the big classroom. And they did this in a randomly controlled trial. And that's not to say big classrooms aren't good, but that personalized education can be even more powerful. And I think there's some really interesting teams looking at how artificial intelligence could personalize and bring that, per student education in an automated way to everyone, so that everyone has that opportunity of a wealthier child that can afford an SAT tutor. I think there's some amazing stuff going on in biology right now, where not only are the tools improving with CRISPR, and automated transcriptomics and things like that, but our ability to understand the high-dimensional data of biology, which you've got, I can't even remember. Let's just make up a number, 100 trillion cells or something. These are high-dimensional numbers to really understand biology. And when you can start saying, hey, it turns out a human can't think about more than, I don't know, for me, like 3 things. If I'm really stretching, 7 at once. A computer can think about a couple 100,000 things at once, trivially. And so there's just so many opportunities to use these novel systems of sentience and pattern recognition that are better at different things than humans, to tackle problems in new fundamental ways that I think will really help a lot of people.
Super interesting. So energy consumption, which I almost think of as the continuation from the you must have seen the graph of the amount of time the average worker has to work in order to afford an hour of light. So it's 100 years ago. Oh yeah, it's a good graph. It's like,
And it's just,
yeah, it's like 2 hours originally, and then it just has shrunk all the way down to something on the order of like 10 seconds of work gives you 1 hour of light for on average for your average worker. I thought it kind of parallels this graph. It's almost like the inverse to, or it's very similar to the every 18 months technology doubles and processing power doubles. Is that Moore's law? Yeah.
Moore's
No.
law classically states that you sort of double the amount of transistors in an
Yeah.
area. And I think that it's been largely modified to say the amount of compute you can
hmm
buy for a certain price will usually double sort of every 18 to 24
hmm
months. And it's turned out to be surprisingly true. It's also quite interesting. It's I forget whether it's Moore's law. They've got a different name for the guy that came up with it. But solar has been exponentially declining as well, where it's something, I'm going to get the exact numbers wrong, but ballpark, a 20% drop for every, I forget, doubling of installed panels, something like that. And it's down to, for instantaneous, non-stored, good condition solar, which is a lot of caveats I just gave you, cheaper than coal and natural gas in many cases, which is mind-blowing. And if you extrapolate that trend out, it's been going for 40 years. If you extrapolate it 15 years, solar will be, order of 10 times cheaper than any other energy form available today, again, under the sort of best case situations.
Yeah.
But that really changed things.
Yeah,
And
absolutely.
that's within our lifetime.
Out of these categories, what if you sort of look back and you're 70 years old, 80 years old, or 200 years old, and you think, okay, I've made big impacts in these areas, certainly, health being one of them with hearing aids. Are there others where you're like intuitively attracted to trying to solve problems there? Or vice versa, are you are you areas where you don't want to get into, and you're like, this is just not interesting?
Any of the ones I mentioned would be pretty interesting. I think you're moving humanity forward on any of those. I think, if you're going to look at the pillars of civilization, it's energy, raw materials, and intelligence. And if you're going to really do the dimensionality reduction, you can measure societies by just how much energy they successfully captured. We're getting cheaper energy. I think I've had friends talk about mining and its improvement. I don't know a darn thing about it, but that's raw material. And then AI, that's sentience. And it's, AI shouldn't be, at least in my mind, shouldn't be spoken of in isolation. It should be spoken of in, usually practically speaking. Smart people like OpenAI, they're doing general AI, but like in an applied setting, like this is how it made protein folding better. This is how it won at chess. This is how it became an incredibly thoughtful teacher or counselor or friend. These are interesting applications, and I think humanity is going to get good at putting AI against a bunch of the applications which solve a real problem for people in the next 20 years in a way that meaningfully advances the capabilities and quality of life of humanity.
Yeah, it's so interesting. AI as a concept is it's easy to get your mind wrapped around what it is. It's a software program that is continually learning using the inputs that it's getting from the world. But it's different than any other software program I'm familiar with, and most people are, where you're programming the if-then statements and you're programming the gates, so to speak, so that it's absolutely predictable. Whereas AI is kind of like this spin to say it starts to modify itself. It's this recursive programming loop. Do you have a good grip? I mean, does my explanation make sense? Do you have a better way of sort of explaining how it works, other than just it's artificially intelligent?
Yeah, I'll say the way I think of it, and I don't know whether this will be helpful to this audience or not, but this is people have figured out a way to you ever do linear regression in high school or something where you have a bunch of dots and you have a line? People have figured out a way to take one input, how far is it this way, to another output, how high up is it, and make it work for things way more complex than lines. Now, I'm kind of reducing that a little bit in that, every training point is like one of those dots. And, whether someone says, oh, I did a convolutional net, or I did a transformer, these may be things you've heard of. These are just different ways to essentially do the same thing of put in a bunch of data, have a bunch of labels, and say, I want my statistical model to get better and better and better at taking this input and predicting this output. And that to me is just sort of creating a complex pattern matcher, just the way you could teach a child or a human or anyone to say this matches to that. It doesn't strike me as all that different than other programs. Obviously there's the nature of you shape a statistical map via data, which is different than saying, hey, I'm going to think about it hard and create my own rule. It's creating its rule based on the inputs and outputs you give it, but I think we will increasingly realize this is powerful. And maybe your point is that rather than a human sort of saying, and this is how I see the world, we're allowing something else to see the world. Maybe to your point, to sort of analyze what's different, I think we will, within our lifetime, have programs that are statistical mappings of inputs and outputs that are trained on very subjective functions that create a complex inner life of equal complexity to the statistical mapper in our heads, such that reasonable people could call it conscious. And that obviously is pretty weird. Somehow, in my mind at least, that's still just engineering, so it doesn't seem particularly absurd or categorically different than other things that humanity has created. We've created machines that can lift heavier loads than humans. We've created machines that can see further than humans. We're about to create machines that can think just as well as humans.
Yeah.
But
I've thought about this. I'd be curious to get your reaction on this specific point. That the way that the senses are typically described is that you have 5 senses: sight, hearing, touch, taste, smell. I think that's 5. But those are the 5. And then I've thought about what thoughts are. So people, there's been a few people I've listened to. This has been a while, so I can't remember who it was. But describe thoughts as being a sense in and of itself. So when you're sitting there, just in a meditative state, and you have no sensory input, like you're in a separate sensory deprivation tank, and there's nothing happening for you. There's just you're purely conscious. You could, at that moment, you could see something, you could hear something, taste, smell, touch. But you could also have a thought come in your mind, and you objectively don't choose to have the thought. You're not thinking, okay, let me bring back this childhood memory. It just appears, and that just appearing is kind of just what a sense is. You're just, there it is. I'm now smelling the smell. Yeah. And I've thought about maybe that's the right framework for thinking about consciousness, in terms of your base state is just existence, and then say the computer is on, it's not, there's nothing processing, and then information is now processing, so things are now being realized. And I wonder if does that line up with how you sort of see this merging of computers and consciousness?
So as an example, and take this is speculatory stuff, so it's worth what you paid for it. Nothing, just to be very transparent. But I have heard consciousness, and this jives with me. I have heard consciousness described as the perception of one's own internal thoughts. So here's your mind, and then here's this other thing, your prefrontal cortex, and it's saying, oh, what am I thinking? And it's perceiving it, and it is manipulating it. And of that self-perception and manipulation, there suddenly is the unawareness of that I exist, because you created a machine, and then you created another machine within the machine to look at the machine and say, what the hell is the machine doing, and make it run a little bit faster and better and oversee it all. And that creates consciousness. And it's quite interesting, actually, to note that the most successful AI algorithms today are built on the concept of self-attention, in which part of the neural network looks at the other parts of the neural network and assesses what the heck it's doing and which parts are relevant. You can call this transformers, you can call it attention. I would be very surprised if any algorithms today are conscious in even a remote degree to which humankind is. But I think you start to see that self-attention is, just as you said, a sensor, and whether the semantics of whether it's a sensor or whether it's, part of an informational processing system that is aware of another part of an informational processing system, who cares? But that this description is very astute, that things pop into it because it is observing another thing that is doing stuff. And that this is probably the direction that man's sentient statistical modeling machinery will take as it becomes ever more capable.
That's super interesting. It reminds me of my college experience having way too many weed brownies, and I'm on my bed and I'm in this like recursive loop thinking, oh my God, I just had this thought. Oh my God, I just had that thought that I just had this thought. And it just, it's kind of what seems to almost predictably happen, right? It's like that kind of, so it's fascinating how that is overlapping in AI development with how we're sort of wired, for lack of a better word. There's actually a really good book on this. It's like a science fiction. It's called A Strange Loop. Actually, the person who recommended this to me is a person who introduced us, Eddie Marks. We'll throw a plug out for him. He's he's a great developer, artist, goes by Finch, and he recommended this book, A Strange Loop, which talks about kind of the merging of AI and technology advancing to the point where it's reproducing a lot of the ways that we think. So, yeah, really fascinating concepts. And of course, that the invitation I always feel is, where does it go? What's the, and the farther out you go, the harder it is to see naturally. But it is. I almost view like one kind of interesting thing I think about is the world today feels very empty of a common moral system. There used to be religion that held society together under these common principles or common value systems. And the world very much today feels chaotic, I believe, because of the religious underground has been ripped out. I
mean, you don't subscribe to Xi Jinping thought.
there's
moral framework over there.
Yeah, I mean, there's definitely publications you can subscribe to. I think mostly
got some pamphlets.
Yeah.
There's thetons. You just gotta pay enough money.
Yeah.
You get rid of the thetons, and then you hang out with John Travolta.
Yeah. That's the modified. That's the remix. There is a lot of like remix religion, but on whole, it feels like people are, they describe themselves as I'm spiritual but not religious, and I think that kind of represents the vibe of like, hey, we're not really subscribing to anything we can't absolutely prove, and we worship science, by the way. So I think that the AI has sort of this appeal in that it is, I think, becoming more or less synonymous with how we would describe religion as you go farther out in this conversation. With the singularity, AIs are reproducing ourselves. This conscious machine that we're producing is it's what we were destined to do. Humans are the moth that turns into the butterfly, or the caterpillar turns into the butterfly, by analogy. So I think it's interesting to sort of think of it in that context.
I mean, you may be adding a little bit of nuance there. As fun as the Latin Deus ex machina is, God from the machine. I mean, I wouldn't see AI as a God substitute in any way. It's at least to me. And I was raised religious, but the beauty of religion is this call to be a better person tomorrow than you are today, and a feeling of purpose and meaning. And you might pick that man's purpose and meaning is to exceed ourselves and be better tomorrow than we are today. And there's a number of dimensions to do that: better quality, better health care. In some ways, I happen to think greater capabilities to explore and understand the universe are meaningful to me, and being better tomorrow than we are today. But I would see sort of our ability to build these knowledge systems as one of those ways we can improve the Earth's capabilities, rather than necessarily an end-all be-all.
Yeah, I agree with that. I think the other wild spice you throw in the mix of all this consciousness, AI coming together is, I'm in Portland now, and Portland, along with a couple other cities, but largely Portland, is a leading center for psychedelic research. And I view that the tools that we're using to observe how the mind works, the experience of what the brain provides, is, if you look at it from a scientific perspective, psychedelics are, they're like the telescope. They allow you a different perspective onto the experience of what it is. And I think that's fascinating, because it'll just increase the sophistication of our perspective with the mind map that we all have. And I think it's just exciting. It's really, it makes it, the mystery of it is really what I find super intriguing. coming at it from like, there's something here that we don't quite see. The gestalt of the picture isn't clear, or it's different for different people and they see it differently. But finding that cohesive view of the world, it's like, I find that intuitively just really attractive to try to figure that out, and other people seem to, and it's interesting how that in and of itself is hardwired into us, you know, to make sense of the world. So
Yeah, I mean, humans are nothing if not the most successful pattern matchers and narrative makers that have ever
yeah,
lived, and you know, hopefully we can keep driving that forward on, I think, a number of
yeah.
dimensions.
Well, man, I really appreciate you diving down different rabbit holes with me. It's been a lot of fun. I always really love, you know, just going deep with you. And obviously, let me know when you know, if and when you start working on something new. Would love to talk about that at some point. You know, I'm sure whatever you
Absolutely.
do next is going to be
Well,
exciting.
this was what a freaking pleasure, and yeah, let's make sure I'm on here again when I have something new to talk about.
Awesome. All right, sir. Dwight Crow, over and out.
Rock and
Bye.
roll. Talk soon.